This presentation is about stereotype threat. Sometimes research has shown differences in performance based on the social groups that people belong to, such as race and sex. For example, a typical finding is that girls do worse on the math portion of the SAT, while boys do worse on the language portion of the SAT. What's interesting is sometimes these differences are not due to true differences. That is, girls aren't actually worse at math, and boys aren't actually worse at language. So then what does explain why we sometimes find these differences? Well, the explanation is stereotype threat. So stereotype threat occurs when the person is aware that there's a negative stereotype about their group. So in our example, it will be that the stereotype is girls are bad at math, or that boys are bad at language, and their group membership, in this case their sex, is made salient, or in other words, brought to their attention. So there are two key elements here. Number one, the person is aware of the negative stereotype about their group, and number two, they are currently thinking about the fact that they belong to that group. So these two things cause anxiety in the person because they're worried that they will confirm the negative stereotype about their group. So for instance, a girl might be worried that she will do bad on the math portion of the SAT because of the negative stereotype about girls doing bad on math. So ironically, this worry about confirming the stereotype actually causes worse performance. So in effect, the girl actually does do worse on the math portion purely because she was worried she was going to do worse on the math portion. So sometimes these differences between groups that we find is in fact not due to true differences. So it's not that girls are worse at math, but because girls are having anxiety about being worse at math. And so how do we know that these differences aren't real? If you remember, there's two important elements for stereotype threat to occur is number one, awareness of the negative stereotype, and number two, salience of that particular group membership. So we can kind of manipulate those things. So for instance, if we tell a girl that, in fact, girls aren't worse at math than boys, girls are just as good at math as boys, we actually get rid of that negative stereotype. And so here, girls are not going to be worried about confirming this negative stereotype since it no longer exists. And in fact, when we do something like that, the differences that we typically find between girls and boys at math disappear. So that's one way to kind of get rid of stereotype threat and the consequence of worse performance. The other thing you can do is kind of make that group identity less salient. So, for instance, not having girls fill out their sex demographic prior to taking the test, that would make them less aware that they're a girl at that moment. They're not going to be thinking so much about the fact that they're a girl, despite the fact that there is this negative stereotype. Or by another way you can do this is by making a different group more salient. So here you can have a girl think about the fact that she belongs to a certain racial category rather than her sex category. And so that too will also get rid of the stereotype threat, and the girl will perform just as well on the math portion as your typical boy. So in summary, stereotype threat is when there's a negative stereotype that causes people to perform worse, and it's due to their anxiety about confirming that stereotype.